Hello YouTube, thank you for joining me today, and anyone who watches this after I've recorded it live. I just want to do another quick video today. This one will be under an hour and talk about something that I find interesting that some of you are probably familiar with and some of you are probably unfamiliar with. So I wanted to talk a little bit about John B. Calhoun, the scientist, and his research with rats and mice and effects on population density. So when I was a kid, there was this movie called The Secret of NIMH, which is a really good movie, actually, a good kids movie, kind of dark and scary in some parts. Kind of even mature for kids, but still overall a movie I'd recommend if you're a parent and you've got young kids. This is a cartoon movie from the 80s, and I really like it. But I didn't know, I was familiar with this growing up, and I had no idea that The Secret of NIMH, which is based on a novel or a children's book, uh, a children's short fiction novel, I guess. It was written in, I think, 1978, called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH. That book later got turned into this animated kids movie, and I had no idea that the Rats of NIMH were actually real. Basically, NIMH stands for the National Institute of Mental Health, and there were a bunch of experiments that were done over decades of time by a guy named John B. Calhoun, with some really startling and creepy implications that a lot of people aren't aware of. And one of the ways that this factors into some of the other stuff we've been talking about is, in my couple of streams back, I talked about the Georgia Guidestones, and I talked about how most people I've talked to disliked them and thought they were evil or satanic, and they didn't like the guide point in the beginning about guiding reproduction wisely and maintaining a healthy population number. So I have a lot of friends who are Catholics, and they don't support eugenics or abortion or anything like that, and they don't believe that the world is overpopulated, and they basically just think it's our duty to continue to reproduce. And I'm of the opinion that we need to do it wisely and intelligently because we have problems and there's a lot of pragmatic stuff to consider. So I'm going to be interviewing my friend Ryan on Wednesday night, and he's a very, very dedicated practicing Catholic. He probably knows more about Catholic doctrine than anyone else I know, so that'll be a good conversation. But in preparation for that, I wanted to bring this up because there's a lot of parallels between what we learned in this research and living in a modern city like Toronto, especially when it comes to all the degeneracy that is so abundant now. So I will show you guys. Basically, give me a moment here. And Calhoun had started in the 60s with rats, making habitats for them, and then there was a guy in much earlier, Malthus, who the term Malthusian dilemma is attributed to his work, which was after World War II. Populations started to explode, and people got worried that expanding populations were going to result in disaster for food production and stuff like that, and that's what prompted Calhoun to start making doing these experiments, basically. And this is a picture of John B. Calhoun here meeting the Pope. He had a lot to say on how relevant this would be for humanity, and there's some spiritual implications of this too. In one of his papers, Calhoun once wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. Threatening life and evolution are two deaths, death of the spirit and death of the body. Evolution in terms of ancient wisdom is the acquisition of access to the tree of life. This takes us back to the white first horse of the apocalypse, which with its rider set out to conquer the forces that threaten spirit with death. Further in Revelations we note, to him who conquers I will grant to eat the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. And further on, the leaves of the tree were for the healing of nations. This takes us to the fourth horse of the apocalypse. I saw a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him, and they were given power over a fourth of the earth." So basically he quotes Revelations in one of his magnus opus papers that concluded everything, and he was talking about the effects of vice on population, because while these experiments are done with rats and mice, they're mammals, they're not humans. Even in the 1970s, people were drawing stark comparisons and noticing a lot of similarities. And although these are rats we're dealing with, not actual humans, I think there's a lot that can be applied to human society here that we need to take seriously. So, back up a second here. Basically, the idea is that he made these enclosures for rat populations, and they had all the food and space that they could possibly need. But these colonies of rats continuously went extinct, and basically they didn't go extinct from starving to death or anything like that. They went extinct from their behavior changing into these abnormal behavior patterns, and then stagnation would set in and the colonies would go extinct, basically because in the end the rats no longer had the ability or the instincts to care for their young, and so the colonies went extinct. They all every single time they went extinct. So it wasn't so much the effects of the physical environment that were a problem for the rats, it was their behavior and their social behavior specifically. So the biggest problem is that almost instantly when these environments are made, he built them in such a way that they were different quadrants of the environment, and almost immediately the rats, when these colonies began, jockeyed for dominance. They set up a hierarchy. Like all mammals, rats are also hierarchical, and they created these social hierarchies. And then from there, certain alphas kind of had control over one segment of the environment, and we saw some very strange adaptations starting to kick in that I think are applicable to humans in a city that we can all kind of recognize. So, much like rats, humans, we have social hierarchies. There are powerful or popular people, like everywhere, from everyday life at school, at high school, right down to macro level politics. You have high status men and you have low status men. And the interesting thing with the rats is, once hierarchies had been established, the beginning research, by the way, was done at Johns Hopkins University to begin with Norway rats. And with this early research, the rats would create hierarchies, and then there would be high status and low status rats, and then the rats couldn't leave the enclosure. So it's a sealed off environment, and they're stuck in there. They can't just leave and go explore a new colony. They're stuck in this colony, and there's high status and low status. The low status males would basically then form three different types of groups, and this is really fascinating. The first group of low status males were labeled as homosexuals or pansexuals, and they didn't compete for status anymore. And oddly enough, they would basically be minding their own business most of the time, not competing with anyone, but they would stop trying to ever mate with females. And oddly enough, they would only try to mate with the dominant alpha male rats. And what's even weirder is that the alpha male rats didn't seem to mind and just kind of let them. So right away their sexual behavior changed drastically. The second group were labeled somnambulous, which these type of rats moved slowly through the pen, didn't interact with others, and were extremely fat and healthy looking. So they didn't do anything either. Their sexual behaviors also changed. And the third were called the probers. That's what Calhoun labeled them, and they were pansexual, and they would try to basically have sex with anything, either gender, of any age. And one of the reasons that the colonies eventually collapse is that the female rats, when they're ready to give birth or they're in heat, the males can smell it, so they don't leave them alone, and then the males basically are attacking or forcing themselves on the females all the time, so that the females don't actually have time to focus on the young, and the young start to die. The probers often will go into the burrowing areas of the female rats and find dead newly born rats and just eat them. So they were cannibalistic and pansexual, and that's super creepy. So what I find intriguing about this living in Toronto is Toronto is starting to resemble one of these rat experiments in that you have what I would consider to be an overpopulated city where people have a hard time leaving, and then it's extremely we have social hierarchies as well, and then you get these different classes of people like incels. Obviously, sexuality has drastically changed in our society in the last generation, so we have a much higher rate of what I would, I guess, non-heterosexual behavior, and then we also have, for example, I live in a neighborhood near Liberty Village, which is a condo complex sort of for upper class yuppies who don't really ever engage in they never have to really engage in conflict with anybody. So there's a category of rats in these experiments that basically match that. They were dubbed the beautiful ones. Male counterparts to these non-reproducing females were soon dubbed the beautiful ones. They never engaged in sexual approaches toward females, and they never engaged in fighting, and so they had no wound or scar tissue. Thus their pelage remained in excellent condition. Their behavioral repertoire became largely confined to eating, drinking, sleeping, and grooming, none of which carried any social implications beyond that represented by continuity of bodies. And this kind of makes me think of a few things. It makes me think of Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, and it also makes me think of today. There's a whole class of people that are obsessed with fitness, upper middle class people, yuppies, and people that have money basically, and they it's like the bodybuilder subculture in Toronto here. Like they're obsessed with their physical appearance and they work out all the time, but they're also sort of metrosexual. They're not overly heterosexual, and they don't actually have to fight or engage in violence. So they're perfect on this surface, but they also have the privilege of not having to worry about actual violence. So after a while, although these rats had everything in their environment necessary that they could possibly need for survival, the environments were basically described by researchers as slowly descending into hell, and then literally becoming a hellish state of existence for the rats, and then they would all go extinct. So, just to give a little recap here, if you look on Wikipedia under John B. Calhoun, just because I'm struggling here to paraphrase this properly, let me read you a paragraph to put this in more, give you a better idea here. In the early 60s, NIMH acquired property in a rural area in Maryland. The facility was built on this property, housed several research projects, including those headed by Calhoun. It was here that his most famous experiment, the mouse universe, was created. In July of '68, 4 pairs of mice were introduced into the habitat. The habitat was a 9-foot square metal pan with 4.5-foot high sides. Each side had 4 groups of 4 vertical wire mesh tunnels. The tunnels gave access to nesting boxes, food hoppers, and water dispensers. There was no shortage of food or water or nesting material. There were no predators. The only adversity was the limit of space. Initially, the population grew rapidly, doubling every 55 days. The population reached 620 by day 315, after which the population growth dropped markedly, doubling only every 145 days. The last surviving birth was on day 600, bringing the total population to a mere 2,200 mice, even though the experiment setup allowed for as many as 3,840 mice in terms of nesting space. This period between day 315 and day 600 saw a breakdown in social structure and in normal social behavior. Among the aberrations in behavior were the following: expulsion of young before weaning was complete, wounding of young, increase in homosexual behavior, inability of dominant males to maintain the defense of their territory in females, aggressive behavior of females, passivity or non-dominant males with increased attacks on each other which were not defended against. After day 600, the social breakdown continued and the population declined towards extinction. During this period, females ceased to reproduce. Their male counterparts withdrew completely, never engaging in courtship or fighting and only engaging in tasks that were essential to their health. They ate, drank, slept, and groomed themselves, all solitary pursuits. Sleek, healthy coats and an absence of scars characterized these males. They were dubbed beautiful ones. Breeding never resumed and behavior patterns were permanently changed. The conclusions drawn from this experiment were that when all available space is taken and all social roles filled, competition and the stresses experienced by the individuals will result in a total breakdown in complex social behaviors, ultimately resulting in the demise of the population. Calhoun saw the fate of the population of mice as a metaphor for the potential fate of man. He characterized the social breakdown as a second death, with reference to the second death mentioned in the biblical book of Revelations. His study has been cited by writers such as Bill Perkins as a warning of the dangers of living in an increasingly crowded and impersonal world. Others took different lessons. Medical historian Edmund Ramsden has hypothesized that the mouse society fell from excessive social interaction rather than density per se. A writer in IO9 stated, instead of a population problem, one could argue that the mouse universe had a fair distribution problem. So, basically, people of different political backgrounds have interpreted this, as you can expect, in their own ways to kind of fit with their political leanings. So, communists will see this as a wealth distribution issue. Other people will interpret it how they want. But when I look around Toronto today, I notice certain things about this environment that feel like they're mirroring what happened in these mouse experiments. And one of the key things that they also learned from this, and this is something I want to tie back to some of the other stuff I was mentioning in the other podcasts, is that I think that currently the Earth is already overpopulated, and people will argue with me and say, "Oh, we could sustain, so many more people, 10 billion people." But what I mean is, I don't think we can sustain those people. We're already overpopulated in terms of social density. So something that was discovered through these experiments, it's really pragmatically important to understand, is the difference between physical density and social density. Physical density is the amount of space per person in an environment, and social density is the number of individuals occupying a space. So, because we are mammals and we have this built-in biological circuitry that makes us hierarchical, what happens in nature is that you find a place in the social hierarchy, and if you can't, or if you don't have a place in that social hierarchy, we have these exploratory circuits that get activated, and we go in and we explore new environments to try to see if we can create something there. So in these experiments, much like modern cities that the poor are being herded into, we can't really leave. So we are trapped in these cities that are overcrowded, and then we're getting all kinds of problems. Obviously, we have the incel community, which is a large percentage of disenfranchised young men who can't find mates and aren't really on the social hierarchy of, they don't make enough money or whatever. And they, similar to in Japan, they become reclusive. They spend most of their time at home online. They're not engaging in social activities like before. They're not going out and they're finding mates and reproducing. So I've also seen a video by Jordan Peterson where he talks about the coming population decline just because so many people are not reproducing anymore, and that I think that I am anticipating that happening. But for now, Canada's population keeps increasing because of mass immigration, not because the local population are actually having a lot of kids. So we'll see how this plays out long term. But right now, I think we're already overpopulated because our social density capacity is too high, and we're also contributing to the destruction of ecosystems at an alarming rate. So I'm definitely an environmentalist. I'm not worried about climate change rhetoric. Or environmental alarmism or anything like that for to make money for elites, but I am concerned about rapidly declining ecosystems on this planet, and the sustainability of those ecosystems I think has already been jeopardized. So one of the reasons I like the Georgia Guidestones is that they're anticipating the fall of society that's coming, and they're saying in the future we need to be intelligent about who and how we allow to reproduce, because if we allow the unintelligent people to too quickly outbreed the intelligent people, we're going to go downhill pretty quickly. And I was watching Edward Dutton's podcast, The Jolly Heretic, this week, and he was saying that IQ in the human race is declining quite quickly. We know that for sure. And at the rate we're going, he said it would take about 20,000 years, and within about 20,000 years, the human race would be back at pre-Homo sapien levels of intelligence, so more like Australopithecus or like a monkey. Basically, we would have deteriorated into just some primitive primate without even language at that point. So we do have issues here, And what I'm suggesting from a pragmatic point of view is that we learn from this stuff and then we try to redesign our cities um, in ways that are more conducive to mental health. There's another thing that we also learned about. Beside the most important key takeaway from all the research, like I was saying, is understanding the concept of social density. But looking here for behavioral sync. Oh yeah, here I'll pull up the Wikipedia article on this because we also learned about behavioral syncs, and most of you probably understand what operant conditioning is, which is, it's what Pavlov's dog was all about. If you pair a stimulus with a certain activity, it can get hardwired into your biology. So, if you ring a bell every time you feed your dog, eventually when you ring that bell, the dog's body biologically will start to salivate because it's being triggered. It knows that stimulus means that food is coming. So, with behavioral syncs, this is really important to consider too. The pragmatics of this, when we're talking about um, politics and social engineering and things like that. Let me just pull up the. Sorry, guys, give me 1 second here. Where is my? There we go. Behavioral sync is a term invented by ethnologist John B. Calhoun to describe the collapse in behavior which can result from overcrowding. The term and concept derived from a series of overpopulation experiments Calhoun conducted in Norway rats between 1958 and 1962. In the experiments, Calhoun and his researchers created a series of rat utopias, enclosed spaces in which rats were given unlimited access to food and water, enabling unfettered population growth. Calhoun coined the term behavioral sync in his February 1st, 1962 report in an article titled Population Density and Social Pathology, an Scientific American, on the rat experiment. He would later perform similar experiments on mice. So, in 1962, Calhoun described the behavior as follows. Many female rats were unable to carry pregnancy to full term or to survive delivery of their litters if they did. An even greater number, after successfully giving birth, fell short in their maternal functions. Among the males, the behavior disturbances ranged from sexual deviation to cannibalism and from frenetic overactivity to a pathological withdrawal, from which individuals would emerge to eat, drink, and move about only when other members of the community were asleep. The social organization of the animals showed equal disruption. The common source of these disturbances became most dramatically apparent in the populations of our first series of 3 experiments, in which we observed the development of what we call a behavioral sync. The animals would crowd together in greatest numbers in one of 4 interconnecting pens in which the colony was maintained. As many as 60 of the 80 rats in each experimental population would assemble in one pen during periods of feeding. Individual rats would rarely eat except in the company of other rats. As a result, extreme population densities developed in the pen, adopted for eating, leaving the others with sparse populations. In the experiment in which the behavioral sync developed, infant mortality ran as high as 96% among the most disoriented groups in the population. So, and then also here, applicability to humans. Calhoun himself saw the fate of the population of mice as a metaphor for the potential fate of humankind. He characterized the social breakdown as a spiritual death, with reference to bodily death as the second death mentioned in the biblical verse Revelations 2:11. Controversy exists over the implications of the experiment. Psychologist Jonathan Friedman's experiment recruited high school and university students to carry out a series of experiments that measured the effects of density on behavior. He measured the stress, discomfort, aggression, competitive, and general unpleasantness. He declared to have found no applicable negative effects in 1975. Researchers argued that Calhoun's work was not simply about density in a physical sense, as number of individuals per square unit area, but was about degrees of social interaction. So, it's also interesting to think about this in terms of pandemic level or pandemic era society, because with people adapting now and streaming services and everything, more and more people are just staying home and not leaving the house. There's less people are socially interacting with each other. More people are wearing masks. Some people continue to wear masks. We've had children that have spent 2 years growing up, young children in developmental stages, getting used to everyone wearing a mask, so they're not learning empathy the way they should naturally by seeing facial expressions as much. And we know that we have huge classes of people now, especially males, that are not, they don't have a mate and they don't really socialize with the opposite sex. They tend to just stay home, have the incel life, spend a lot of time playing computer games. We also see the explosion of the LGBT community, and not just homosexuality, but what I would consider like depravity and degeneracy on a high scale. Um, Pansexuality, as they promote it in gender studies courses, is increasing. And we're also living in a late stage capitalism now where the divide between the rich and the poor is getting stronger, and traditional morals are definitely being eroded or have eroded completely. And we're seeing what I would consider the spiritual death of society, in some sense, or there's a minority of people and conservatives and people not in the fridge that are moving out of the cities and building parallel societies in rural areas, and that's all the stuff that I applaud and that I want to be a part of with this channel. But when you're talking about like the majority of people living in being herded into the cities, I think we can see a lot of these manifestations of behavior that we saw in the rat experiments, manifesting here among humans. And people are generally losing empathy. More people they're more aggressive, less empathetic, um, and just an increase in degeneracy because we don't have any kind of spiritual, like religion is being the influence of religion on society is being eroded, and so we're seeing a whole bunch of interesting effects. Again, humans are not rats. We're a lot more complex than rats, but there's something worth considering about as mammals when we look at these and we look at human cities. Sorry guys, I'm just checking the chat now. So some people have commented. If you haven't seen the Calhoun documentary, you should watch it. I'm not sure which one specifically you're talking about, but in the description of this, I've linked a video from Down the Rabbit Hole. It's like 20 something minutes long, but it's really fascinating. That's where I got a lot of first found this topic. So if you look in the description of this video right there, I link to a better YouTube video that will summarize this better. I just did my own video today because I want to add my own commentary about how I think this applies specifically to, our human society today. Jesus Gonzalez says, "I really wish more inner city kids could experience wilderness camping. It's a seed planted that they will never forget, helping, I believe, them to get out of their cityhood sooner rather than later." So I 100% agree with you. I was raised out in the country. My dad was a Boy Scout leader. So in my town in Norfolk, we have less than 2,000 people, and we have a lot of space and a lot of nature. And so I was camping at a very young age. My dad would, as a scout leader, would go with the scouts on a monthly basis and camp outside. And then also in high school, just with my uncles, cousins, and my dad, we'd go to Algonquin Park. We had at least 3 good canoeing, portaging campouts in Algonquin. And my dad was actually raised in inner city Detroit before coming to Canada. So he would talk to me as a kid, as someone who grew up in the city, didn't have those experiences. And when I was little, he was like, you should feel lucky to have these, and I do now because there is something like it's just something really nice about having those experiences, understanding them. Inner city kids don't really know what they're missing out on, in my opinion, when it comes to that. And it's especially like I live in Toronto right now, or I divide my time between here and Norfolk because I'm single and I'm already grown up. But the city is, in my opinion, not a place to ever raise a kid. The best place to raise children, for sure, I think, is out in the country where they have more space and the social density is lower, and you can be exposed to family values, and human behavior is just different in those communities. And there is something to be said about living in a community where you have to act as a community. You have to. This is something specifically for sure. Like this is a human thing, but for example, in Europe, throughout European history, because of the harsh environment of Northern Europe, the population was often very sparse. It was hard to live there, and you had to. This is a part of an evolutionary psychology thing. You had to learn to get along with other people in your environment because you were codependent on each other for survival. And that's where a lot of the complex human behavior kind of mechanisms evolve in. And so today we've sort of removed those mechanisms because people can with skip the dishes and just staying home with the internet, streaming movies and stuff. They don't really have to go out. A lot of people work remotely from home, and so they don't really feel the same codependency that you feel when you're living in a more rural area, and you have to kind of like a rural community. People work together um, for everything, like from food production to everything else, and you have a sense of community and you care about your neighbors and stuff like that. I don't even know the other people, the other tenants in this building I live in, let alone anyone else on this street. So there is no sense of community really here in Toronto. Not the same as like when I'm back home in Norfolk. And I think I'm a fairly well-adjusted person because I was raised in that environment and not a modern city. Um, so, just going over here, I'm just trying to think of if there's anything else I wanted to mention today. Basically, I wanted to make you guys aware of the rats of NIM being real, and the research of John B. Calhoun, and what social density is, and what a behavioral sink is, just to be aware of it and to think about that in terms of modern society. When you look at modern SJWs or progressives, soy boys, and the type of people that um, are usually causing problem, like the Antifa types, or just earlier today I was watching a video in Hamilton when they had that PPC event, and a la DeSoufi and those other Antifa types like were screaming in that old lady's face and stuff. You're gonna, as a population explodes or gets bigger and increases, as Peterson has pointed out, political behavior is very closely linked to your temperament, which is biologically um, influenced. So when I watch evolutionary psychology podcasts with Edward Dutton and stuff, and they talk about how because we've basically gotten rid of natural selection with industrial technology, so the weak survive, and as in this context, as the population balloons, you're going to have a lot of far leftists and a lot of angry young men and a lot of deviant sexual behavior and a lot of aggression and hatred from the lower status males. And I think that's what you really see, especially with like the Ala DeSoufi types, the Antifa types, when they go around attacking people, or even when you look at Kyle Rittenhouse in the States and the people that he shot that were assaulting him. This all seems like predictable behavior from a certain demographic of people, especially low status males living in this kind of overpopulated area without any proper social guidance. And so the other thing was, by the end, Calhoun would near the end of experiments, take some of the healthiest rats and put them into a new environment and see if he took the 4 strongest males and females out and let them try to start over with the colony survive, and it never did, because at that point the behavior is already the behavioral the ability for the rats instinctually to understand how to behave was just gone, so they couldn't raise children anymore, basically, is the big part of it, if they would even understand how to approach or find a mate. So Antifa, to me, are basically the low status rats of the Calhoun experiments, but on a human level. And it's just, even if you disagree with me there, it's worth considering, like, to what degree there's a crossover here, because there's something going on, I would say, in modern times that we need to understand. And Fanny and I had a conversation the other day about atheism, and I'm going to interview my friend Ryan about Catholicism on Wednesday, and I'm going to get his take as a Catholic on reproduction, population size, and how he feels about things like eugenics or just selective breeding from his religious point of view. I think that'll be a really good conversation, so that's going to be on Wednesday. On that note, I'll keep this stream fairly short because I don't really have much else to say today, but I just thought it would be interesting to point all this out to you. I think there's one more thing I wanted to go over here. So this was a final thing that Calhoun had written, and it was his call to action, basically, and I want to end it on reading this to you guys because this is really worth considering. He said, "For an animal so complex as man, there is no logical reason why a comparable sequence of events should not lead also to species extinction. If opportunities for role fulfillment fall far short of the demand of those capable of filling roles and have expectancies to do so, only violence and disruption of social organization can follow. Individuals born under these circumstances will be so out of touch with reality as to be incapable even of alienation. Their most complex behaviors will become fragmented. Acquisition, creation, and utilization of ideas appropriate for life in a post-industrial, cultural, conceptual, technological society will have been blocked. Just as biological generativity in the mouse involves this species' most complex behaviors, so does ideational generativity for man. Loss of these respective complex behaviors means death of the species. So I'll end it on that, but I think that this is very much worth considering from a pragmatic point of view when we talk about society and we talk about politics and how things should be um, designed, how cities should be designed, and immigration and social roles and and just behavior in general. This is good to know, and it's good to have the knowledge of this in your mind to bring to the table when we discuss those things or when you form opinions on those areas in general. So on that note, I will wrap up the stream now. Sorry, there's one. I see Tim Burns in the chat says, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the 70s and 80s in southwestern Alberta. Society's definitely different now. Nice, that must have been pretty beautiful. I've never been to Alberta, but I have friends there, and I really want to visit there, and I'm hoping that this year I get a chance to go check it out. The 70s, and in my opinion, we're all nostalgic for the time we grew up, kind of. I think that the 90s in small town rural Ontario in the 1990s was like peak civilization. We had good technology and good things, but things hadn't began to disintegrate like they have now. Things have definitely changed, not for the better in my opinion, quite drastically. But yeah, the 70s and 80s sound like good times, and the 90s was good times too. That I think on a graph, those are the best times of human civilization, and I think things have gotten worse and will continue to decline, and maybe we can find a way to reverse the direction that this ship is going in, but it's going to be tough. It's going to be really tough, especially with the way we're losing freedoms. We're losing freedom of speech, body autonomy, late stage capitalism, mass immigration, the disintegration of religion, which is a spiritual guidance system that we need. Just everything is not getting better in my opinion. But I am hoping that at least those of us who are awake can ride the tiger, so to speak, as things kind of decline, and then maybe we can build a parallel society, or we can, in the aftermath, we can continue to build sub-communities that are valuable and help people and that sort of thing. So that's kind of my commentary on that. Thank you to everybody that watches this video. I appreciate you guys so much. I love my audience. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and sub to the channel if you haven't subbed already, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow. So thanks everybody.